Sounds good, okay.
Let me just introduce you. Are you happy to stand?
Yeah, sure thing.
Okay, well, our speaker today is Alex O'Connor, and Alex is a first-year student at the University of Oxford, reading theology and philosophy. It's funny, they always say reading, don't they, on University Challenge rather than studying, but anyway, it's one of those old-fashioned terms. Alex is an ex-Catholic, he's an atheist, a science enthusiast and an advocate for secularism. His YouTube channel, which goes by the name of Cosmic Skeptic, has got 250,000 subscribers. You may be one of them. So I'm absolutely delighted that he's agreed to speak to us today with a brand new talk which will go into video, and no doubt that will be uploaded to his channel, which will give us some publicity as well, as long as he stands in front of the Dorset Humanists sign there. So will you please give Alex a very warm welcome.
Hello everybody, thank you for being here. Let me just sort out these notes. Yeah, thanks for all coming out. It's nice and reassuring to see so many of you here, especially to talk about something that seems to be such a specific issue as ethics. I want to present some philosophical ideas that I haven't really spoken about before, and I hope that I'm essentially hoping that we can get towards or move towards something that resembles objectivity in ethics, and in determining what we should be doing, how we should be behaving, how we can make sense of terminology like that, if there's no objective basis for these kind of things, like in some kind of God or religious tradition. So I've spoken quite a bit about morality before on my YouTube channel, which, as David says, some of you may be subscribed to, and hopefully all of you will be eventually at the end of this evening. I've spoken about morality before, and I've been very critical of the idea that you can ground it in any kind of objectivity, the idea that you can have, that you can say as a matter of fact that certain things are good or bad, or that you should or shouldn't do them. And I've had conversations with my friend Stephen Woodford, who runs another YouTube channel, and we've publicly discussed it, and it's been something that people have just not wanted to stop talking to me about. And Stephen recently came to Oxford, because these conversations that we had got far more attention than I ever would have thought for talking about morality. Stephen came to Oxford, and we spoke privately about our ideas, and we've essentially come together at this point, and we now roughly agree. And so I'm hoping to kind of explain where I'm at the moment. Hopefully it's a view that Stephen will be able to eventually endorse. But it's changed, essentially, from what I've spoken about in the past. So this is a good opportunity, and I'm glad we're filming it, because I can put it on my channel, and finally I won't have to keep updating people. So there are a few steps to this, what I'm going to have to do to convince you, hopefully, or at least open you to the idea that there can be such a thing as objectivity in ethics, or something that resembles it. There are some stages in the arguments, and these might seem totally unrelated, but they're actually really important, and they will come together at the end. The first thing I'm going to have to do, and I'm really sorry for this, but I'm going to have to try and convince you that free will does not exist. I'm going to have to try and convince you that you're not in control of your actions. Now, I wouldn't be surprised to learn that many of you already maybe think that way, or are familiar with the philosophy at least, but it's an important part of ethics, and I think people will understand intuitively why that's the case. But once I've done that, I need to point out that since if you are not in control of your actions, as the free will philosophy that I'm espousing states, then we have to determine what is. And what I think is actually determining your actions are your desires, and sort of a psychological determinism that's going on in that sense. So we have to talk about the nature of desire, and the second thing that I want to convince you of is the idea that desire itself is centered around pleasure and the avoidance of pain. And not only that pleasure is something that's desired, but the pleasure in itself is the only thing that can be desired in itself. This is a very utilitarian case, but I'm going to try not to cross the line into saying that it's necessarily desirable, that you should desire it, just that it's the only thing you desire. And again, this might seem a weird thing to be arguing, but it will come together at the end. So what I'm essentially hoping to argue is that if you don't have free will, and you are determined by your desires, and you desire a certain specific thing, then whenever you behave, because your behavior is determined by your will, which isn't free and is determined by something else, and we know what that thing is. When you behave, it can be indicative of beliefs that you hold about the natural world, which can either be right or wrong. Now, this may be slightly confusing or odd, but the pieces will come together. Essentially, the reason why I've called this talk the good delusion is because traditional notions of ethics, as I see them, don't make any sense when we remove free will from the picture for fairly intuitive reasons. But I think that what we can get to is a system where we don't say that certain actions are good or bad as an objective matter of fact, but that certain actions demonstrate that you as a person have certain beliefs that are either right or wrong as a matter of fact, and it's practically indistinguishable. So to try and avoid confusing anybody any further than I perhaps already have, I think we should just get into things. So I want to try and leave a bit of room for Q&A, because the pieces of the puzzle fit quite trivially together. Once you agree that free will doesn't exist, and once you agree with the second part to do with pleasure, they go together very easily to come to the conclusion. So it's kind of in the concepts themselves that the controversy is going to lie. So I want to make sure that we've got time to ask questions about the concepts themselves. But we need to go through them. So the first thing is to mention why there is a problem with ethics in the first place. And when it comes to ethics and morality, the big problem is that no one seems to agree. It's a fairly, that's not an amazing observation, but I don't just mean that people don't agree with moral conclusions. People can have agreements about what is right and wrong, but have completely different justifications for those things. So there can be two people who both completely agree that murder is wrong, but one person has a completely different justification to the other. Somebody might think that it's wrong because God says so. Somebody might think that it's wrong because they're an ethical egoist, and they think that they should act in ways that are good for themselves, and because we live in a social contract, the best thing we can do is be nice to others so that the behavior is reciprocated. Either way, these are massive disagreements, and very important philosophical disagreements, but the conclusion is precisely the same. So the important part of this philosophy are not the moral conclusions, but the meta-ethical underlying, the justification for the moral conclusions that we come to. So we need to understand what we actually mean when we talk about good and bad, and should not. And the problem is that this is not an easy thing to do. One of the main problems with this is that shoulds exist in an entirely separate category of thought from otherwise familiar natural facts. Famously, David Hume observed that you cannot have premises which talk about the way that things are and get to the way that things ought to be or should be as a matter of logical conclusion. It can't be done. You can say that this is the case, this is the case, this is the case, but you'll never get to a should. If I say to you, it is the case that it's raining outside, therefore you should take an umbrella, it's intuitive, but that's not logically valid. There's a hidden underlying premise there that you should try to avoid getting wet. And Hume's point is that you cannot cross this divide. But an important point to note is that this isn't just true of is and ought. Another thing that David Hume was very famous for is the problem of induction. Induction is the process by which we reason from things that we have observed to conclusions about things we have not, including the future. So how do we know that the sun is going to rise tomorrow? Well, David Hume says that we can't. We don't know that the sun's going to rise tomorrow. What we do is we reason from the way that things are and the way that they have been to how they're going to be in the future. But that's, again, not logically valid. We don't know that the sun's going to rise tomorrow because you can't get a will be from an is, just as much as you can't get an ought from an is. So it's a gap that's very difficult to cross, that can't be crossed as a matter of logic. And that poses a big problem for ethics, because I can tell you all the facts you want about the natural world. I can tell you all about the nature of pleasure and the nature of well-being, but it will do nothing for our understanding of how we should behave. So what I'm going to try and do is come to a conclusion where we can use meaningful language involving shoulds, where I'm going to be able to say that you should do this, you should not do that, and yet not cross the is-ought divide. Stay entirely within the realm of natural facts and scientific, observable, empirical, natural facts. Now, the first step of this, like I say, is free will. So I suppose actually it might be a good idea, perhaps a raise of hands, how many people here, in the traditional sense of a libertarian free will, the idea that you are the author of your actions, you are in control of what you do, how many people here would say that they believe that they have free will? Okay, this is good. This is good. I was terrified that none of you would raise your hand and I'd be massively wasting my time. But it's good to see that a lot of you don't as well, because there's a bit of there's going to be a bit of controversy here, I suppose. So. Actually, in fact, for those people who raised their hands, could you just put your hands up again? Now, just Keep your hand up if you don't mind me just asking you a question. Okay, so you're the front. You say you have free will, and I know I kind of defined it when I asked the question, but what do you understand by free will? Like, what do you think that means when you say you have free will? What do you mean by free will?
So I think that I can choose what I do, although I don't think I can choose what I want to do.
Okay, so you can choose what you can do, but you can't choose what you want to do.
So I can choose not to do things that I want to do.
Okay, so you can want to do something, but then choose not to do it, regardless. So you can't control what your desires are, but if you desire to do something, you can still choose not to do it. Okay, that's a general, that's a fairly, is that agreeable to people? Does anybody have a different? Okay, so this is really important, and that's a fantastic distinction to make, because free will comes down to the nature of desires, and whether or not we can actually act in accordance with, out of accordance with our desires. Now, as you rightly pointed out, you can't control what your desires are themselves. Now, the first step of the free will argument is to recognize that everything that you will ever do as a matter of conscious action, so I'm not talking about unconscious actions like rolling out of bed when you're asleep, because nobody would consider that in the realm of free will anyway. I'm talking about the actions that people would generally consider to be free. So whatever conscious action you make, you'll only ever do it because you desire to. This is the argument that I'm going to have to make. Now, we have a point here that you can desire things that you then, in fact, do not do. And this is one of the most important objections that you get to the free will argument. Because essentially, if you admit that you cannot control what you desire, and you then admit that everything you do is because you desire it, then you essentially are logically led to the conclusion that you don't control what you do. I mean, I hope people would generally agree with that. If I can demonstrate to you why it is that you actually have to act in accordance with your desires, and also it's the case that you can't control your desires, then perhaps some people will be more sympathetic to the idea that in fact you can't control your actions. So it seems that the sticking point is going to be this nature of desire. Now, what does it mean to desire to do something? That's a difficult question, but when we're talking about an instance where you desire to do something and yet you don't, perhaps you could give me an example of something that an example of desiring to do something and yet still not doing it.
Sleeping in when I should be going to work.
Okay, sleeping in when you should be going to work. So you wake up in the morning and you sleep in, and you know that you should be going to work, and you want to go to work, but you still decide to sleep in. Okay, so examples like that. And examples like, the opposite is true as well. So you want to do something but you don't, but it's also the case that you don't want to do something and you do. Like if you don't want to go to the gym, but you still do, you force yourself to do it. These are examples where it seems that you are acting out of accordance with your desires. But we have to think about what we actually mean here, because, for instance, take the gym example. You don't want to go to the gym, so why do you do it? Why do you actually force yourself to go to the gym? Well, it's like, okay, I don't want to go to the gym, but I do want to be healthy. Okay, well, why does your desire to be healthy outweigh your desire to not go to the gym and be lazy and eat junk food? Are you in control of that? Are you able to decide which desire is stronger? Bear in mind, the only reason that you actually force yourself to go to the gym is because you desire your health. If you didn't desire your health, then you just wouldn't go to the gym, because you don't desire to go to the gym. But even though you don't desire to go to the gym, because there's this other conflicting desire, and you do want to be healthy, you do. And it's only because that desire exists, and because it's stronger than your desire to stay at home and be lazy, that you go to the gym. So why is that desire stronger than the other? Do you have any control over that? Well, you simply don't. If you're lying in bed in the morning and you wake up and you think, I want to go to work on time, but then you also think, but I'd also quite like to sleep in. Okay, you've got two conflicting desires there, and the only possible reason that you could decide to stay in bed is because the desire to stay in bed is stronger than the desire to get up to work. Now that could be irrational. That could be a silly thing to do. It could be totally just not thought through. But the fact of the matter is that even if it's unjustifiably so, your desire to stay in bed is stronger than your desire to go to work. Because if it was stronger to go to work, then you would do that. So why is one desire stronger than another? Again, you don't get to decide this. What would it take if you're lying in bed to make you get up and go to work? That desire to go to work would have to overcome the desire to stay in bed. But again, you don't get to do this. You can't decide to desire something as we've already agreed upon. You don't get to say, I want this. So if it's the case that one desire is stronger than another, you will follow that desire. And in every instance, in every single instance, where it seems as though you don't want to do something and you do it anyway, it's always because of another desire. There is some desire to do that thing. If anybody has any objections to this, again, we're going to be doing a Q&A. Examples are one of the best way to get this principle understood and comprehended. Try to think of some examples of wanting to do something and yet not doing it, and where there isn't a conflicting desire that's stronger. Because, as I say, my argument is that you will act upon your desires. Now, there are going to be conflicting desires, so there are going to be instances where you don't act in accordance with the desire, but that's only because there's a stronger desire. So you're still acting in accordance with your desires, if you see what I'm saying. And that will always be the case. And that's one of the things that you'll want to find an objection to if you want to sort of come back on that. So if you think you can think of an example, then let me know. But there's another way to think about this entire free will argument. Because it's a philosophical case that you do everything consciously because you want to, or because you desire to, let's say, or because it's the strongest desire you have. Step 2 is that you don't control your desires. Conclusion, you don't control anything you do. But there's another way to look at this, which is to say, which is to identify a logical dichotomy in physics, or at least the philosophy of physics. That is to say, either the universe is deterministic or it is not. These are the two options. As a matter of logic, it's a logical law that it's either the case that P or not P. It's either that this is the case or it's not the case. Determinism is the idea that the universe is following a set course. Now this makes sense. If we understand the universe intuitively as a process of causation, everything that happens in the universe, and that includes the activity going on inside of our brains and psychology, is caused by something else. And it could be caused by something else inside of you, inside of your brain. It could be caused by something external. But you can take something like a car going by. The car going by was caused by the fact that someone put their foot on the pedal, and the fact that they put their foot on the pedal was caused by the fact that they had a place to go, and the fact that they had a place to go is caused by the fact that they have a job, and this chain of causation goes all the way back to the very beginning of the universe. When a leaf falls off a tree, that happened because the connection of the leaf to the tree broke down, and that happened because of the aging process in the tree, and the tree aged because of the fact that it was planted, and it was planted with this tree, and it goes back and back and back and back and back forever. And this is the deterministic case, that everything that happens is following this set course. If we are on a chain of causation, then because effects necessarily follow their cause, then what we're doing now is the result of causes, and everything that will happen in the future is a result of what's happening now, and it will follow that set course. Now, the only way out of that, the only way to say that actually it's not determined in that sense, it's following a course, but it doesn't mean that everything is on a necessary chain and can't have gone another way, is to say that there are some instances where there's a cause, and yet more than one thing could happen. As to say, randomness. That's the only other option. Either when something happens, it's either determined in the sense that it was always going to happen via a chain of causation. The only other option is that it's indeterminate, and if it's indeterminate, then it's random. Now, if the universe is determined, then you don't have control, because you couldn't have acted differently. And free will, if it means anything at all, means the ability to have acted differently. If you were put in the same situation, there was a genuine option open to you, and you could have done this, or you could have done this, and they were both equally possible. So if you were put back in that situation, you could have gone the other way. That's what free will means in a meaningful sense, the ability to have acted differently. If the universe is determined, which intuitively would seem to be the case outside of our own experience of free will, we would wager that it makes sense to say that if the universe is a process of cause and effect, then the whole thing's determined. Okay? In that situation, you clearly don't have free will, because of the fact that any conscious action you make is the result of neurons firing in your brain, which is itself the result of neural processes, which itself will be the result of some external factor or something. When you slam your foot on a brake, it's because of the external influence of seeing a car coming towards you or something like that. That chain goes back forever. But the other alternative is indeterminism, which I've said is randomness. And randomness, by definition, you don't have control over either. So think about this dichotomy. It has to be the case, and I press this as a matter of logical law, it has to be the case that either the universe is determined or it is not. And if it is determined, then we're following a set course, in which case you couldn't have acted differently. And if it's not, then yeah, you could have acted differently, but you wouldn't have been the one deciding that, because it would have had to be random. So either way you look at it, you are not in control of those actions. Now, this is the strong case of free will. You can get there more intuitively or against free will. You can get there more intuitively by, if you take an argument like, if there are two people and both commit a crime, both commit a grave immorality, and then you learn that one of them grew up in an impoverished background and had a poor education, etc., etc. And the other one had the most sort of the perfect background, like functioning family unit, and had a great education, a great job and everything. You might be inclined to see the first person as less morally responsible for their action, because you think, well, they're probably predisposed to being violent or to being evil, let's say, because of the hardships that they've endured. Well, that's the case for all action, is the point that I'm trying to make. Because if you discovered that your friend, who is a perfectly agreeable person in every situation, perhaps your best friend or a parent or someone that you know, were to commit a crime that's just unspeakably bad. They go and murder a family, let's say, and you are just floored by this. You think, I don't understand how this person could have committed this crime. And when they go to hospital, this is an example that comes from Sam Harris, I think. When they go to hospital, when they go to prison, they start complaining of headaches. And so they're taken to hospital, and it's discovered that they've got a brain tumor pressing against the part of their brain that deals with rational thought. How does your moral evaluation change of that person if it's discovered that when they committed this crime, it was because they had a tumor pressing against the part of their brain that deals with rational thought? You'd probably think that makes so much more sense. And you'd probably be relieved to find that your friend doesn't need to be held morally culpable in the same way that they would have been before. Because the only reason they committed this crime was due to some kind of activity that happened in their brain over which they ultimately had no control. Well, that's the case with all conscious action. It's all the result of some activity happening in your brain over which you have no control. You don't decide which way your neurons are firing. If I were to rewind the clock to yesterday and put you exactly where you were, and put every single atom in the universe in exactly the same place, including the atoms that make up your brain and the neurons that are firing, and they're moving in the same direction at the same speed, do you really think that you could have acted differently? It doesn't make any sense. Okay, the only way that you could rewind the clock and really have acted differently is if for some reason your brain just did something different. But if all of these atoms of causation are moving in that general direction, then they're on that course and you wouldn't have been able to act differently. And if it is the case that all of this conscious action comes from something over which you have no control, then how on earth can we hold anybody morally culpable for their actions? How can we blame people when they do something wrong? How can we praise people when they do something good? It makes a mockery of the criminal justice system. When somebody is put up for a crime and they plead insanity or they plead some kind of circumstance that forced them into doing an action, we let them off. We give them a lesser charge and we hold them less morally culpable. Why? Because they didn't get to choose it. They didn't control it. Well, you don't control any of your actions in that meaningful sense. Okay, because if I hold a gun to someone's head and say, go and rob that bank, they're going to go and rob that bank. And they'll probably say that they were forced to do so. And yeah, I mean, it's true, but Not really. I mean, they could have chosen to let me shoot them in the head. They could have chosen not to rob the bank. But you would say, but no rational person would be able to refuse to do something at gunpoint. No rational person could do that, and I completely agree with you. No rational person could. It's impossible, because your desire to just commit this crime and get it over and done with will be stronger than your desire to be shot in the head. I can assure you of that. You don't get to choose that. You try it. Like, put yourself in that situation and say, I'm going to try and desire to be shot in the head instead. Now, there may be circumstances if you're like, if you're an intelligence officer or something like that, and you may have been trained into that, but I mean, in a general sense, you as an individual in that situation, you don't get to decide which is better. Now, the fact of the matter is, you could have let me shoot you in the head. So should we hold you morally culpable for the crime that you commit when I hold the gun to your head? Probably not. And I don't think a criminal justice system would, and I don't think that we would hold that person morally culpable. Why not? Well, because they're only doing it because I'm forcing them. But what does it mean when I'm forcing them? I just said I'm not forcing them. They could choose to be shot in the head. Okay. So you don't mean that they're being forced. What you mean is that they have a desire to do this, which they couldn't help having that desire because the only other option was to be shot in the head. It's the case that they still desired to go and commit this crime over being shot in the head. But they couldn't help desiring that. Well, look, you can't help your desires no matter what. I hope you see what I'm saying here. This is a really important realization. And that's why we need to be careful about the language we use when we talk about coercion and force. Because the only reason that we consider coercion to be force is because of the fact that by coercing someone, what you're essentially doing is forcing upon them the desire to do something. That's what it is. Because you're giving them, you're making it such that the only alternative is something which they cannot possibly desire, such as their murder. But they could choose it. It's within the laws of physics for them to choose to be murdered, but they're just not going to do it. It's not possible on a psychological level. But that's the case with all actions. Now, not to the same extent. When you have to choose between two flavors of ice cream, it's not the same severity of choosing between life and death, but it's the same principle. Okay? In the same way that you can't decide to want to be shot more than you want to commit the crime, you can't decide to want chocolate more than you want vanilla. Can't be done. And I hope you see now why it actually does make sense to think in terms of everything that you consciously do being due to your desires. Because, yes, there are cases where you seem to act out of accordance with your desires, but that's only such as in the situation when you go and rob the bank. You don't desire to rob the bank, but you desire not to be shot. So you are still acting in accordance with your desires. Now, there is one tiny, perhaps, get-out clause that people have tried to come up with, and it's called compatibilism. And it is, how shall I say this, nonsense. It has a strong tradition in philosophy. It comes, one of the earliest thinkers to propound it was Thomas Hobbes. Thomas Hobbes, for instance, defined free will, or he said that a person's freedom consists in no stop in doing what he has the will, desire, or inclination to do. Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy defines compatibilism in the following way. It says that freedom of the sort that's pertinent to moral evaluation is nothing more than an agent's ability to do what she wishes in the absence of impediments that would otherwise stand in her way. Compatibilism is the view that yes, you can't choose your desires, but as long as you're able to act in accordance with your desires, you're still free. Now, this is the intuitive way to think about free will, because a lot of people would define free will as just the ability to do whatever you want. Well, of course, you can do whatever you want, and the compatibilists say that that's all that matters. All that matters is that whatever it is that you're doing, it's determined internally. It may be determined, you may have no control over that deterministic process, but as long as the cause is internal to you, as long as the cause is psychological and comes from you, the agent, it doesn't matter. Like, you are still the author of that action, and that's what makes sense. Well, okay. So there are a number of problems with this. The first is to say that even if you say that you are the origin of the causation of the the action that you committed. If you're saying that it's determined, like, who cares where it came from? Like, yeah, it may have come from inside you, but it could have come from my liver. Like, it doesn't actually make a relevant difference, the fact that it came from inside of your brain, if you didn't choose to make it come from inside of your brain. It may as well come from my big toe. But secondly, there's an important point to be made about the idea of compatibilism. And the reason it's called compatibilism is because it's the view that determinism, the deterministic universe, is compatible with free will. So compatibilism assumes determinism and says that it doesn't matter because as long as the cause is internal, who cares? Well, causation is a chain. It doesn't have a start and stopping point. Okay, if something is caused internally by your psychology, that itself, that cause will have been caused by something else. And you go back far enough, and it will take you outside of the human mind. Peter van Inwagen has a good point on this. He brings up the idea of untouchable facts, as he calls them. He says that, let's say, for argument's sake, that there is a relevant distinction to be made between facts that originate from inside of your brain and facts about the universe that are outside of you. And he says that untouchable facts are the facts that exist outside. The fact that, for instance, 10 million years ago, the atoms in the universe were arranged in X formation. That is an untouchable fact, and nobody, even the people who agree that free will exists, even the compatibilists, nobody would argue that we have any control over that. Like, everybody can agree that that's completely out of the picture. Now, what Van Inwagen says is, well, if I can show you that there is an untouchable fact here, and that there's something else here that happens as a necessary result of the untouchable fact, then that result is itself untouchable. This is important, because if determinism is true, then it means that your psychological state, in a really long-winded way, goes all the way back to the beginning of the universe. So the only reason that things in your brain and things in your psychology and things in your environment are the way they are now is because of this deterministic process that stretches back to 10 million years ago, and the atoms were moving in the right direction to create the Earth, well, it's longer ago than that the Earth was created, but to create you and to ensure that you would be here thinking the things you're thinking now. So, trivially, then, if it's an untouchable fact that the universe was so-and-so 10 million years ago, and it's a necessary result of that state of affairs that you are now in the psychological state that you're in and doing the things that you're doing, then it's an untouchable fact that you're doing these things. If it's a necessary result, compatibilism completely breaks down. The only way that the compatibilist can salvage free will is by redefining free will in a sense that makes it lose all of its meaning. By just saying that free will is nothing more than the ability, as Hobbes says, to do... Well, I've lost it, but to be free is to find no stop in doing what he has the will, desire, or inclination to do. So you desire to do something and you have no restriction on doing that. Well, like, what are we talking about here? If I desire to go and do something and something gets in my way, that we'd call that a restriction. But we'd equally call it, we'd see it as equally unfree if I'm walking down the street and someone pushes me into the road. Did I choose to go into the road? No, I didn't, because I was pushed, because I was coerced by an external factor. What I'm saying is if I choose to step into the street, that's due to these psychological conditions that stretch back to the beginning of the universe that I'm equally not in control of. So I'm not in control of when my brain decides to cause me to step into the street, just as I'm not in control as when someone pushes me into the street. And all the compatibilists can do is draw a completely arbitrary distinction between causes that happen outside of the brain and causes that happen inside of the brain. That's all they're doing, and it doesn't make any sense. That's what Daniel Dennett does, for instance. He's probably the most prolific, famous, current compatibilist philosopher. I reached out to him to come on my podcast, and I said, would you like to discuss free will? And he got back to me and said, I watched your video, I don't like your definition of free will, so no thanks. I said, well, that's fine, that's exactly what I want to discuss, because I think that your definition loses the meaning of free will entirely. So we've got a problem. All right? If moral responsibility in the traditional sense requires the ability to have done differently. If I say that you should have done, like Kant's principle of ought implies can. If I say that you ought to do this, then necessarily you have to be able to do it. I can't say that you should have done this if it was impossible for you to have done it. I can't say that it's immoral of you. I can't say that it was wrong of you to be born, or it was wrong of you to allow some dictator in some faraway country to commit some act of war. Like you had no control over that. And obviously, the big problem is that if moral responsibility entails the ability to genuinely choose between different options, well, that choice doesn't exist. And that's why I think that good in the traditional sense is a delusion. Because good and bad and should not are grounded in the ability to choose between actions. And that simply doesn't exist. So what can we do? This is why I think it's important to create a system of ethics that can exist within this framework and can be practically indistinguishable from the traditional sense of morality, but can actually be philosophically justified and doesn't require free will. Because like I say, morality traditionally has completely required free will. It's unthinkable that you can say, that you can talk about morals and should and shouldn't if everybody is just following a course that they can't control. Like, how can you possibly hold anyone morally accountable in any meaningful sense? Well, let's try. So I want to leave that hanging in the air, and I hope that many of you are at the very least now sympathetic to the idea that free will doesn't exist, even if you're not convinced. But again, that can come through Q&A and subsequent thought, but it's one of the things that I'm most convinced of in philosophy, is that free will in the traditional libertarian sense simply doesn't exist. So we'll leave that hanging in the air, and we'll move to point 2, and hopefully what's going to happen is I'm going to bring point 2 up to the same point, and they're going to conjoin, and the road is straight from there. And we'll be able to get to a fairly intuitive conclusion, I hope. So point 2 is about the nature of desire. Because my argument is, of course, that everything that you do is based on your desires. Whatever is your chief desire, whatever is your strongest desire, which you don't get to control, that's what you'll act in accordance with. Okay, so what do we desire? Well, obviously we desire many, many things, or at least it seems that we do, but I'm going to argue that we don't. I'm going to argue that there's only one thing that in itself is desired, and that's pleasure. Now, pleasure is a difficult thing to define. I like to define it along the vein of Derek Parfit, who says, essentially, pleasure is what is by definition wanted when being experienced, just as pain is by definition not wanted when being experienced. That's all that pleasure means. Now, when I say that I desire to have a meal or something, it's not strictly true that I desire to have a meal. I desire the pleasure that I'm going to derive from getting that meal. Now, you might say, no, you desire the nutrient. Well, I don't desire the nutrients. I desire the pleasure that will come from being well nourished. And we have to think about, I'm not talking about pleasure in a trivial sense here. Like, pleasure, the word itself is used quite promiscuously. I mean pleasure in a very strict sense of just being what is wanted. Now, or not what is wanted, because that would be just defining, I'd say that you desire what you desire, which is just a tautology, but pleasure itself, so let's take another example, for instance, like if you desire to go for a run, there could be a multitude of reasons for this. Like, you could desire the pleasure that you get from the actual activity of running, you could desire the pleasure that you'll get from living a healthy lifestyle, or whatever it is, but you don't desire the run itself. The only thing that you actually desire is pleasure, and everything else that you desire is just a means to get pleasure, to achieve pleasure. Now again, you run into the problem where it's like, we seem to desire things that aren't in fact pleasurable. Now this is the biggest objection to this point. It seems like trivial to suggest that everything you do is just because you want to, because it brings you pleasure. Like, that's just a trivial point to make. And the trivial objection is, well, obviously we desire things that aren't pleasurable. And there are two kind of versions of this. The first is when we desire something that we know is not pleasurable, and we think it will bring us some other benefit. So we do it for virtue's sake, let's say. And we know that it's not going to be pleasurable, but we desire it anyway. The second version of this objection is that we get it wrong. We desire something thinking that it's pleasurable, but it's actually not. Now, we can take both of these in turn. So the first point and the most difficult point is the apparent fact that we can desire things that aren't pleasurable. For instance, going to the gym, we desire to do that even though it's not pleasurable. Or virtuous behavior is another example of this, when you put yourself in the line of fire or something like that. Like, it seems that you know full well that that's not going to bring you pleasure, but you're going to do it anyway. Okay, well look, virtue itself is based in pleasure. People derive pleasure from living a virtuous lifestyle. And pleasure itself as well is the antithesis of pain. Pleasure can be thought of in terms of the avoidance of pain. So, if you are, one of the most difficult problems for the idea that pleasure is the only thing that is desired, and this, by the way, is the view of John Stuart Mill. Mill takes it a step further, we'll get to that in a second, but he has to make this case to make his utilitarian case, because utilitarianism is based on pleasure, just as this ethical framework is, and he has to make this case. And one of the biggest problems that comes to people who espouse this utilitarian view is the example such as the soldier jumping on a grenade. You're in a room and the grenade comes into the room, the soldier just throws himself on the grenade to save his fellow man. There's no way that can maximize his pleasure. He's not doing that because of the pleasure that it brings him. Well, yes, he is. There are a few ways around this. The first way around it is to say that he could be acting out of like reflex as a matter of his training. If you are trained to habitually put yourself in the line of fire, then you're doing something out of a matter of habit. If I habitually, fiddle my fingers or flick my nose or something, then it's, again, because of the free will component, we didn't really choose to do that. It's not something that it just kind of happens. It's like a reflex. But that's perhaps too easy. Okay, so let's say that this soldier actually makes the conscious decision. He looks at the grenade and thinks, I'm going to throw myself on that grenade. Well, why does he do it? Because of the virtue of doing such. It's like knowing that it won't be pleasurable. Well, there are two ways, again, to understand this situation of the soldier throwing himself on the grenade and still having it in terms of pleasure. The first is to take the Aristotelian view that this soldier is choosing a momentary, intense pleasure over a lifetime of a duller pleasure of living. But I think the more sensible way to look at this is that, like I say, since pleasure can be defined in terms of the absence of pain, that soldier, as a virtuous human being, and that's not a compliment, that's a matter of his psychology that he doesn't get to choose. Like, he is just a virtuous person who derives pleasure from being virtuous. If he didn't throw himself on that grenade, then he'd live the rest of his life in guilt. That's pain. Again, pain defined strictly in terms of